Hey guys, so as I told you, I'm going to talk about promises and async await specifically. I just wanted to get the temperature of the room and try to find out who's into JavaScript, who's into callbacks, promises, async await, generators. So by a show of hands, who here is currently working with promises?
Does promises in Swift count?
Yeah, sure. Who is working with async await? Okay, so pretty much everybody's informed. So we're going to make this quick and painless. I'm just going to get through the whole thing, and hopefully maybe you'll learn some new pattern you haven't seen yet. I'm not going to show a lot of new stuff, probably. So yeah, that's the topic we're going to approach. And first, just for conventions, I'm going to use some ES6 and ES7 syntax choices. And the first is I'm not going to use functions the way you would do pre-ES6. So I'm just going to use arrow functions inline just to save space for the code. And then I'm also going to do object destructuring. I'm just introducing this because I didn't know who was going to show up and if it was going to be more of an intro-level crowd or an advanced crowd as you are. So through callbacks. So probably everybody has worked with callbacks. Either you have worked with callbacks in an asynchronous operation sense, meaning you've done it to avoid blocking operations in JavaScript, or you have just to do normal non-blocking operations. So callbacks are not restricted necessarily to avoid to avoid blocking operations in JavaScript. So this is how you would do a normal callback operation. We define a getBooks function. There's going to be a lot of book-themed code in here. So suppose we have a library and we just want to do operations regarding our stock. So that's how you'd build a getBooks function. We're going to try and see other options with promises and async await. That would be the output of that. Oh, by the way, if you find any mistakes, just tell me. And if you have any questions in the meantime, also, I would prefer if you raise your hand and ask right now, then save it for later, because then I'll get lost. So the big monster of JavaScript, callback hells, everybody hates it. And that's the biggest motivating factor, probably, for people to start using promises and async await. So for the uninformed, or the ones who haven't gotten to it yet, this would happen if you wanted to do operations that depended on each other in an asynchronous fashion. So you just get the books, then get the authors from the books, then get other books by the same author, and it would just scale into what we call callback hell, or the pyramid of doom, or many other names you've probably heard. So yeah, this is our way of getting into promises. So you can safely use promises today. No hand-holding needed. Maybe if you're going for a front-end code, maybe use Babel just for safety and input your promises polyfills if needed. Promises are usable in Node since version 0.12. So previously, we defined getBooks as a function that received a callback. Now we're going to do it as a promise, assuming we've defined getBooks as a function that returns a promise. This is how a promise works. So getBooks invoked, it returns a promise. Then the promise has two hooks, then and catch. the then hook is going to fire if the promise resolves successfully. The catch hook is going to fire if the promise is rejected. Being rejected means it's a parallel to throwing an error. So you can also assign a variable to our getBooks promise. This would be a pending promise. You could do synchronous operations in the meantime, and then you would declare the then and the catch hooks, which you would use to process the information delivered by the promise. So if you weren't, if you came from a callback mentality, you would probably fall into the mistake of getting into promise hell, which is like pretty much the same thing as callback hell. But promises offer us a better way of doing things. And this concept is called chaining. So chaining just means with the value of the first resolved promise, you would input it into the second function that returns the second promise and return that promise. And therefore, you could just chain every operation you need to do. It would simplify your process. So at the end of this functionality, if everything went well, you would have a similar books from that author object array. Promises also allow you to interweave catch and then blocks. So you could handle an error from the getBooks function and then deliver the logic that you would do if the promise resolved successfully, and then return the next promise, and then catch the error for that promise and handle it in the way you find necessary, and so forth. So you do not need to only put a catch block at the end. You can do pretty much whatever you want with it. So just for an example, how do we create a promise? So assuming like you might be using Mongoose or some NoSQL database that allows you that exposes a model to you. So in here, we would define a function that returns a promise, a new promise. In that new promise, you would give it a callback that takes a resolve and a reject callbacks. Then you do your operation inside the promise, and you would resolve the promise with the valid value. If everything went well, you would reject it if there was an error midway, and you have at the end the logic that we've seen before, where a promise either logs the valid value or an error that got caught. This could be shortened if you were actually using a Mongoose model. Mongoose models also allow you to get a promise directly from the method of the model instead of giving it a callback. So sometimes you could just use shorthands, and that would save you a lot of code. That's if you're using Mongoose, this is the same thing as this. It would deliver you the same results. So there are a few useful things you can do with promises. A lot of times you do not need the value of the resolution of the first promise to execute the second one or the third one. This would consume like a lot of time and resources. So you just get the books and then wait for that to get the magazines, and then wait for that to get the movies. A better way would be to do everything at the same time and just get the results of all of them when all of them are complete. So for that, we use promise all. To promise all, we give an array of promises. And when all of those promises are resolved, then we get a call on the then hook that delivers us an array of the object results of each of the promises in the same order. If any of the promises fail, the catch hook will fire, and you'll be able to handle that error in any way you see fit. There's another useful thing in promises. So you can raise promises against each other. That means that if I give it 3 promises in an array, the first one to resolve will fire the then hook, and I'll get the value of the first one to resolve. The other 2 are like lost. They might resolve, they might not, and the promise race doesn't care. So another useful thing is if you're working in Node, the util module exposes a promisify method. This method allows you to practically turn a callback function into a promise, into a function that returns a promise. So the first I declare the getBooks function that takes a callback, and then I pass it to promisify, and that gives me a function that returns a promise. So I could basically get any function in JavaScript, anything that takes a callback, and magically, instantaneously, turn that into a promise without having a lot of work. I took a lot of time to learn about this, and I lost a lot of time converting like callbacks in other crazy ways. This would be the result. Then something fun. Sometimes I simply, either for testing or for nefarious purposes, I want to stop the execution of the program without stopping blocking the whole thread. So if I just want to delay a step for any reason, I can just define a function that returns a promise, that invokes a set timeout, that gets a callback, that gets the resolve callback as a callback. This way, this is a simple way to just pause the execution of your code. We'll see it again when we get to Async and Await. So one of the pains of promises is reaching all of your data. If you've worked with anything like this before, you'll probably know that in the third then hook, the authors and similar, the books and the similar books, Yeah, here's a mistake. So these similar books should be defined, and the other 2 should be undefined, because we cannot simply reach into the other 2. This is one of the pain points of promises. So that's one of the reasons why you would adopt